Greetings and welcome back. It's your host, Gabe Morales. In my book, Gangster's Paradise, Gangs in the Pacific Northwest, I address the existence of organized crime figures, organizations in the area over past years. In this episode, I will cover some of those subjects, as there seems to be a lot of confusion and general lack of documentation about them. In my last video, I spoke about West Seattle gangs, and outlaws in the Pacific Northwest are nothing new. Gangsters and other criminals have been present ever since the mid-1800s. In my Triads and Yakuza videos, I also described their activity in the Seattle-Tacoma area, as well as the city of Portland, Oregon. And I've also covered outlaw motorcycle gangs in the Pacific Northwest. The Irish and other ethnic groups in the Pacific Northwest were involved in crime rackets from the early days of the Oregon Territory, later to be divided into Oregon and Washington State, as well as Idaho. But they usually kept a low profile. As long as they paid off the cops, who were often also Irish, there were very few problems. Sometimes they paid them off in cash, sometimes in contraband. The same went for politicians. For instance, Roy Olmsted, a former Seattle police lieutenant, became the king of Seattle bootleggers when Washington State banned alcohol in 1916 and during the Prohibition period. Olmsted was fired from the police force in 1920 when he was caught running booze, working with Johnny Schmar, who ran liquor down from Canada into the Puget Sound area via speedboats. Olmsted was able to release his product to thirsty Seattleites via guys like Frank Gatt, who ran a local popular restaurant. Olmsted was finally caught and convicted in 1925 and sentenced to 4 years hard labor at the federal McNeil Island prison located just south of Tacoma, Washington. On November 7, 1899, the city of Seattle passed an ordinance which made gambling a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine of not more than $500 or by imprisonment of not more than 6 months, or both. Then, on March 7, 1903, the Washington State Legislature made it a felony to maintain a gambling establishment, punishable from anywhere from 1 to 3 years imprisonment at the Washington State Penitentiary. But Seattle remained a wide-open city for illegal activities due to rampant political and police corruption, so laws prohibiting gambling were largely ignored. The Great Depression of 1929 to 1939 brought hard times to America, and some people turned to crime. In addition to armed robbery, safecracking, kidnapping, and other violent pursuits, gangsters found that hijacking slot machines was a very lucrative business, and Seattle was no different. On November 26, 1935, Seattle police officers Trent A. Sickles and Theodore E. Stevens were gunned down while investigating a report of a burglary at the Elk Tavern, located in the north end of Seattle. Sickles was shot in the head and died immediately. Stevens was hit in the abdomen and died the following day at the University of Washington General Hospital. Witnesses told detectives that 3 men were seen fleeing from the scene of the murders in an automobile. Roadblocks were set up, but an intensive manhunt for the killers proved to be unsuccessful. In April 1936, police detectives arrested Lester A. Rourke, who confessed to the burglary and implicated 2 brothers in the murders, John, also known as Jack, and Joseph Joe, aka Joe O'Donnell. Rourke soon agreed to testify for the state against the O'Donnells. He gave Seattle Police Department Chief of Detectives Ernest Yoris a signed confession, naming Jack and Joe as his accomplices. He also said the gang had stolen approximately 20 slot machines from various other establishments in the Seattle's north end. Investigators initially theorized that the patrolmen had interrupted a gang of yeggs, or safecrackers, which had broken into about 24 Seattle businesses over the prior 2 months, stealing over $15,000 from safes. But the tavern didn't have a safe. Instead, investigators found that the locks had been drilled out on cabinets containing slot machines, which had been removed and set down on the floor in order to empty them. In late March of 1936, retired King County Detective William H. Sears received information from an underworld source that the O'Donnell gang was involved in the slot machine hijacking racket, which put the burglary at the Elk Tavern a little more into perspective. Racketeers in Seattle were selling illegal slot machines to roadside taverns and nightclubs for around $75 to $100 apiece. The slot machines were later systematically stolen by thieves with inside information, who then sold them back to the syndicate operators for $25. Then they resold them again for a profit. This scenario fit perfectly in with information investigators developed on the O'Donnells. During the trial, Attorney Bullock declared that Joe O'Donnell and Lester Rorick were employed by a faction of Seattle slot machine rackets to steal the devices. He also alleged that there was an opposing faction led by George Reynolds, a former police officer, to protect these slot machines. Acting in self-defense, he suggested Joe unintentionally shot Sickles, whom he thought was the crooked former officer Reynolds. It was a simple case of mistaken identity, and since Joe wasn't carrying a handgun, it was clearly Rorick who had shot Officer Stevens. He would also further testify about the involvement of other corrupt law enforcement officials in Seattle and King County who protected rackets. In November 1936, the O'Donnell brothers were convicted of first-degree murder, but they appealed to the Washington State Supreme Court, which granted them a new trial because of prejudicial arguments made by then King County prosecutor Warren G. Magnuson. They were retried in January of 1938 and once again were found guilty of first-degree murder. John was sentenced to life in prison without parole, while Joseph received the death penalty. In a separate trial, Rorick was found guilty of first-degree murder and also sentenced to life imprisonment. After the appeals process ran its course, Joseph O'Donnell was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary on November 21st, 1938. He chewed gum nervously as he walked up the gallows stairways. And then, just like when he blew and popped his last bubble, it was all finally over. Bandits in the Pacific Northwest may have not been as famous as their Midwest and East Coast counterparts, but they did exist. They just didn't get as much national publicity. September 21st, 1932, 3 gunmen walked into the First Savings and Trust Bank, located in the small eastern Washington town of Colfax, and pulled off a stunning crime. It was a brazen heist with unexpected ties to well-known national hoodlums and gangster violence swooping throughout the rest of the country. The robbery story began when well-armed gunmen, at least one who wielded a machine gun, ordered bank employees and customers to lie on the floor. They forced a nervous cashier to open the safe before stuffing more than $71,000 in cash and securities into a bag. They then climbed into a waiting getaway car and sped away. It sounded like something out of James Cagney or Edward G. Robinson gangster movie. Investigators quickly connected the Colfax holdup to some of the nation's most notorious gangsters, including Edward W., a.k.a. Eddie Bentz, a career criminal from Tacoma, Albert L. Bates, an ex-con, and George F. Barnes, an infamous outlaw better known as Machine Gun Kelly. Even though Washington state authorities never prosecuted the 3 suspects for the Colfax bank robbery, it hardly mattered because by 1936 all of them were already sentenced to long prison terms for other crimes and were sent off to Alcatraz federal prison. It was well known that during the 1950s through 60s, the Cosa Nostra ran a good portion of the U.S. economy, or at least it was known by most folks that they ran much of the black market. They had a long history of paying off cops and politicians, and also were involved in skimming off the lucrative funds of powerful workers' unions, including those in the Pacific Northwest. On June 20th, 1962, Teamsters President Dave Beck, who was well known for strong-arm tactics, began serving 2 concurrent prison sentences at McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington State. Beck was convicted in 1957 in King County Superior Court in Seattle of stealing $1,900 from the Teamsters Union and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was also convicted in federal court of aiding and abetting the filing of a fraudulent income tax return and sentenced to 5 years for that. As I stated earlier, police corruption in Seattle existed since the Wild Wild West days of the mid-1800s. Seattle was well known for having houses of prostitution, illegal gambling parlors, and other forms of vice. When local citizens and churches complained, the police would often make token arrests, but often gave a heads up to the owners before the bust, and were soon released from jail. This all worked out well for the cops, who were paid off because if illegal businesses didn't do well, they didn't get paid either. Plus, they made local news headlines for making a bust, which pacified the local citizens. This system grew even more during the Klondike Alaskan gold rush of the late 1800s. The police payoff system went on for almost 100 years until a series of embarrassing incidents occurred which caused reformist sheriffs and chiefs to crack down on the criminals, and they often emphasized professional ethics by officers. But the lure of easy money and illegal activities by police and government officials did not go away totally. On July 27, 1971, a King County grand jury indicted 28 police officers and political leaders. The indictment charged 19 men, including the former King County Sheriff, a former King County prosecuting attorney, a former Seattle City councilman, and others with conspiracy against government entities. Eventually, 54 public officials were charged with bribery, graft, perjury, and contempt. The councilman was eventually dismissed out of the case, and the former sheriff and prosecutor were acquitted. But Seattle and King County police were not alone in police corruption scandals. On December 8, 1978, a federal grand jury indicted 15 men in Pierce County, including Sheriff George V. Janovich, for engaging in a wide-range racketeering conspiracy called the Enterprise, with a group that was led by Tacoma mobster John Joseph Carboni. The gang was charged with using assault, arson, extortion, bribery, and attempted murder in their effort to control Pierce County's topless dancing businesses in local taverns. In addition, the gang actively engaged in insurance fraud, protection, prostitution, and illegal gambling. Because of extensive local pre-trial publicity, the case was held in San Francisco during the spring of 1979. 6 of the defendants pled guilty before trial and agreed to testify against the others. After 3 months of testimony, the jury found all but one defendant guilty of racketeering. Sentencing for those convicted ranged from 12 to 25 years. It was discovered that Sheriff Janovich received but never reported a $22,000 campaign contribution from Carboni and his crime partner, Ronald J. Williams. Also, at Williams' suggestion, Sheriff Janovich steered an investigation into the 1977 attempted murder of a Washington State Liquor Control Board agent away from the Carboni-Williams organization and towards the local Puyallup Indian tribe. Janovich told Williams that illegal activities in the county were split with Robert Bob Satiacum, a Puyallup Indian convicted of racketeering for selling illegal cigarettes in an unrelated case. While some note that Bob did a lot of good on behalf of the tribe and other Northwest natives, many felt he had a dark side also. Janovich was eventually convicted and imprisoned in the BOP. He was released in December 1986 and died in the year 2005. Located just 2 hours south of Tacoma, Portland, Oregon was not immune to police corruption either. It may come as a shock to anyone today who regards Portlandia as a haven for progressive thought, light rail, microbrews, and lattes. But as author and historian J.D. Chandler describes in much detail in his 2013 book, Murder and Mayhem in Portland, the city was well known throughout the country as being a mecca of vice and sin. For instance, an opportunist conman named Big Jim Elkins arrived in 1937, and by the 1950s, he took over the vice industry in Portland, with much of the police brass and local politicians being on his payroll. Then there was Al Winter, the former Portland mob boss who moved on to Las Vegas and opened up the Sahara Casino. Bill Langley, a Multnomah County district attorney who was caught on tape planning to divvy up payoffs with Seattle mobsters, and Diamond Jim Purcell, Portland chief of detectives, who helped Big Jim get away with many of his crimes. It sounded too wild to be true to many people, but then again, it could be that the history of some gangsters, cops, and politicians in the Pacific Northwest have been forgotten. In 1981, national headlines covered multiple officers on the night shift of the Portland Police Bureau Special Investigation Division being alleged to have invented informants or informant stories to obtain search warrants. Some of these officers were found to have sold drugs or gave away drugs to informants, who were then ready to tell anybody. Other officers stole money, jewelry, clothing, and personal property from suspects. It was ultimately discovered that some officers defrauded the city of tens of thousands of dollars in evidence funds, and many cases were dismissed. I can tell you for a fact that I know that police corruption in Portland did not totally go away, and I have personally been the victim of one detective's wrath. But I would say that the situation has improved. The Pike Street gang that my brother belonged to was led by Lindley Valdez, who was schooled by guys like Frank the Bank Olson and Gunter Manholt, who ran the donut shop at First and Pike. Manholt previously ran a deli in the 1960s with his brother Herbert, called Blumas, which was their mother's name, that was located on Cherry Street by Garfield High School, not far from Miesel's Chicken, made famous by Oprah. They often claimed that they only tried to help street kids, and local papers stated that police said the desperate Pike Street band of young, drug-popping, gun-toting robbers who terrorized scores of restaurant patrons and businesses, committed hundreds of burglaries, and attacked pedestrians for their money and jewelry, as well as engaged in prostitution, were involved in a crime wave that lasted from mid-1979 to late 1980. Either the police or newspapers were greatly misinformed. I know for a fact that the multi-ethnic Pike Street gang operated from the mid-1970s through the mid-1980s. They just moved locations before and after the donut shop in Manhunt was busted, and acted for enforcers at nightclubs such as the Monastery, a disco club located in an old church in Seattle's downtown. And they ran their pimping business out of the Olive Tower off of Bourne Avenue, also located in downtown. And I don't mean to glorify the place, but this story is backed up by multiple accounts that I've heard, including from longtime Seattle DJ and music promoter Nestor Rodriguez, who was present.
Oh man, the one club I remember the most, and if you're under 18, you might want to close your ears. It was called the Monastery. Remember the Monastery?
Yeah, I do, man. It was an old church. I remember my brother Joe and you guys used to run there. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So I said, okay, hey man, I said let's go to church, man. But it was a different kind of church.
Yeah. No, I heard some stories about that place. Pretty wild.
Oh, it's all true, man. And I was like, I was trying to hit on this girl. Right. And then her girlfriend got mad because I was hitting on her girlfriend. I was like, whoa, because back in those days, I was, we weren't really used to seeing that. But, I got along with everybody. So I had a bunch of gay friends and stuff. But it was a really cool place. And there was a lot of underage, because I was like maybe 15 or 16 going to this place. But it was so much fun. The music, the sound system was awesome, but just going to something like that was something I'll never forget. And seeing stuff at a young age, not just the gang stuff, but the pimps, because a lot of the prostitutes are my friends, I mean, they're truly my friends.
Yeah, I totally remember. Do you remember Craig Ayers, Seattle Slim?
Oh, of course.
My brother was a member of that gang, and when he got out of prison, he rented a rundown old house from Gunter Manholt when nobody else would rent an ex-convict one. While the FBI and most law enforcement agreed there were no recognized La Cosa Nostra or Italian family running Seattle, there definitely were organized crime figures active in the area. Some are described in a couple of books: Cops, Crooks, and Politicians, written in 1993 by former police chief Neil Maloney, and Seattle Vice, written in 2010, penned by former veteran crime reporter Rick Anderson. Both books show that Seattle was not the innocent place that many people think it to be. There are also Jewish mafia types. Guys like Frank the Bank Olson, who was a con artist who ran a drug ring out of the Washington Department of Corrections work release facility located on Seattle's Capitol Hill, where my brother was housed when he got out of prison. I can state for a fact that place was a major drug distribution place. He operated this facility with Kenny Brome. Kenny was related to a famous Seattle PI sports writer, Royal Brome, who has a street today named after him, located by the Mariners and Seahawks sports stadium. After that operation was shut down, Olson waged a Bring Back the Original Coke campaign out of a plush office in Seattle's Pioneer Square. He asked for small donations from tens of thousands of old ladies and people who were not happy with Coke making a new recipe. This operation was featured in national magazines and news reports, and it is estimated that he raised over $1 million in that scam. Most of it went into his pockets or his crew's coffers. Later, he ran a food bank, whereby he skimmed off the top again, and often sold the donated food to restaurants. He also ran liquidation businesses that were corrupt, often stocked with stolen goods, taken by local theft crews and gangsters. His last scam was to raise money via his radio and TV station called QTV, where he was the chief executive officer, that he started in the fight against AIDS, which was relatively new at the time. Once again, he got on the air and asked for small donations, but is said to have acquired around $1 million during his campaign. Olson was a well-known homosexual, but was more interested in pocketing the donations than in helping cure the disease. He died soon after, and I understand that he stated he was swindled out of the station, which was sold to the Japanese. According to him, the Yakuza burnt him on that deal. After burning so many people over the years, Olson had finally met his match. There was Sam, the slumlord Israel, and many other local Jewish gangsters. Another guy was Big Marty Levy of the Liberty Jewelry and Loan Pawn Shop. He ran a fencing operation that was estimated to have moved close to $1 million in stolen property. Some guys worked underground and were totally off the cops' radar, or just bribed them to be quiet. Henry Hill, aka Martin Todd Lewis, aka Alex Canclini, was affiliated with the Lucchese crime family in New York until he entered the Witness Protection Program. He was portrayed in the movie Goodfellas, played by actor Ray Liotta. While in witness protection, Hill lived in Redmond and Seattle with his family until he was caught up in a cocaine drug sting in 1987. According to a sympathetic prosecutor, Hill never actually completed the deal because he was too high on coke. Frank Colacurcio was known as the King of Vice and owned a $1.2 million home overlooking scenic Lake Washington. Frank Colacurcio's father was alleged to have La Cosa Nostra connections and got him started in the sex trade business. Colacurcio Sr. notched his first criminal conviction for carnal knowledge with a teenage girl when he was then 25 years old. He served 16 months in prison and was represented in that case by future Washington State Governor Albert Rossellini, who remained friends with Colacurcio for many years. In the 1950s, Frank began operating cigarette and jukebox vending machines in the Seattle area. These businesses became important to organized crime figures who easily schemed money off of them. In 1957, Colacurcio began working with Portland crime figure James Big Jim Elkins to open prostitution houses down in Portland. During the 1960s through 80s, my nationally known hairstylist father ran several salons and knew the who's who of downtown Seattle, including associates of Frank. Colacurcio opened many topless clubs in Seattle and ran a bar called the Firelight Room, which had go-go dancers. And he was alleged to have skimmed money off the top of his businesses. In 1969, Frank was convicted of assaulting a former bartender working as a police informant. 2 years later, in 1971, he was convicted of federal racketeering and conspiracy charges related to operating illegal bingo games. He served 25 months in prison for that. Prosecutors also linked him to a payoff scheme in which local police received payments in order to tolerate illegal gambling. In 1974, he was charged with income tax evasion, but beat that case. In the 1970s, Colacurcio met with Bonanno crime family member Salvatore Bill Bonanno in Yakima, Washington, to discuss a business relationship. When questioned about the meeting, Frank replied, "I went to Yakima to pick peppers, but I didn't pick no bananas." This was in reference to the Bonanno family, which was involved in an internal Mafia war, described by the media as the Banana Wars. In the following years, Colacurcio continued to expand his strip club business and went to war with Johnny Handsome Carboni, who ran sex trade operations in Tacoma and Pierce County, located just south of Seattle. Both Colacurcio and Carboni were later indicted for their activities. As I stated previously, Frank Sr. was good friends with the Washington State Democrat Governor Albert Rossellini, who ran that office from 1957 to 1965. Rossellini saw his support fall when he disparagingly referred to Republican Governor Dan Evans as Danny Boy, and it was brought up that he had intervened on behalf of his friend Frank Colacurcio to obtain a nightclub license in Hawaii when Rossellini was in office. Meanwhile, some of Evans' supporters started putting up bumper stickers that said, "We don't need a godfather." I should be clear that there was never any proof that Rossellini was ever tied to the mob, but the smear tactics appeared to have worked, as he lost the election to Evans. In 1984, Frank Sr.'s name was brought up at a major organized crime conference in Las Vegas. And in 1991, Frank Sr. and his son, along with crew member Nick Fafaro, were indicted for income tax evasion. Frank received 10 years and was released in 1995, but broke his parole for allegedly fondling a woman in one of his clubs, so was sent back to prison until the year 1997. Frank's best earning strip club was Rick's, opened up in the north end of Seattle, in an area known as Lake City in 1988. But Frank was not without competition. Good Time Charlie's in the north end was run by Charles Puzel. Charlie had previously run the Penthouse in 1962, located in Seattle's Pioneer Square area, and sometimes personally ran the bar, and was known as being very friendly with patrons. Club featured such artists as John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Aretha Franklin, and many others. But Frank also ran 3 other clubs: Sugars, located in Shoreline; Honey's in Everett; and Fox's, located just east of Tacoma. His son, Frank Jr., gave donations to many people, including several City of Seattle council members. In 2003, a criminal investigation began in Seattle that was known as Strippergate, focusing on strip clubs owned by Frank Sr. and his son. They were both charged in 2005 alongside ex-nightclub Italian singer John Gil Conte. A case against Frank Sr. for groping another woman, then dismissed on appeal. But Sr. and Jr., as well as Gil, were recharged. Jr. and Gil both pled guilty in 2010 to federal racketeering and engaging in illegal political campaign funding. According to court documents, Conte agreed to a plea deal on conspiracy to use interstate facilities in order to raid racketeering. In 2008, local police and federal agents raided Colacurcio's home and business, and once again they alleged that strip clubs owned by Colacurcio were actually being used as fronts for brothels. I recall when this happened because many females in King County Jail where I worked complained where would they be able to earn their income now. They made a lot of money in these nude clubs, and that they would now be forced to prostitute themselves out on the street and be abused by pimps. In 2009, Colacurcio Sr. and his son and 4 others were indicted and charged with conspiracy and racketeering. In April 2010, Colacurcio's nephew, Leroy Richard Christensen, along with club manager Stephen Michael Fuston, Frank Sr.'s close associate David Carl Elbert, and Colacurcio's driver, John Gilbert Conte, all pled guilty to prostitution and racketeering. Frank remained a target of local law enforcement, but on July 2nd, 2010, he died at the age of 93. Contrary to what some people believe, organized crime still exists in Seattle. For instance, it is known that members of Mexico's 2 largest drug cartels, the Cartel de Sinaloa and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, both have members working in the area. So as to the question if there ever was a recognized Cosa Nostra family in Seattle, no. But there were, and still are, some organized crime figures in the area. I also believe that there are still a few corrupt police officers and politicians, but I believe that situation has improved greatly over the years. Before I end, it is pretty obvious to me that some people still think I am glorifying these gangs and individuals. I totally understand that youngsters often think what these guys have done is cool and may try to emulate them. But no matter what age you are, I hope you see that drinking booze in excess, doing hard drugs, and committing crimes for money may make you feel good in the short run, but in the long run, it will only lead to a life of misery, addiction, pain for you and your loved ones, incarceration, and a possible early death. Again, my sole intent of these videos is to accurately document history, individuals, and incidents that have been proven in court to reinforce my previous statements that all this seldom leads to any good unless somebody finally wakes up one day and learns their lessons. They are lessons that I learned early on, but it is obvious that it takes some longer than others. It seems to me that some people have a problem with accountability and admitting reality. Personally, I don't care if you are the President of the United States, an officer of the law, or a black or Latino man who has come upon hard times. Everyone should be held accountable. I, for one, will not be in denial of documented facts in history. As a Christian, I believe in forgiveness, but that does not mean that I think that we should forget acts of violence. I believe in tough love. Enabling and making an excuse for somebody isn't supporting them. Enabling poor behaviors and denying them ultimately only perpetuates problems by protecting or safeguarding a person against taking on the full consequences of their actions, whereas actually supporting somebody and encouraging them to take accountability and sometimes paying restitution empowers the person to take active steps in their recovery and paying back in a positive manner to the community. This takes hard work and a positive support system, but it can be done. And with that, I hope the rest of your year is blessed. For now, this is Gabe Morales signing off. Gangsters, cops, and politicians.